In this video, which has been requested by many of you, I'm going to show you how I painted a portrait step by step and discuss the 3 topics that are essential in order to grow and improve your watercolor portrait skills. We'll start by mixing skin tones, and if you ever wondered why some artists use only 3 primary colors while others use an entire variety of pigments, this demo will answer all of your questions and help you figure out the best approach that works for your style and level of comfort with watercolors. We will talk about facial anatomy, and without getting too scientific, I will point out some key aspects that you want to keep in mind for any face you paint. Noticing these key facial features in the context of light and shadow will help you better understand where to actually place your colors and what areas you need to skip or blend with clear water. Portrait painting that beginners often worry about too much, but you can actually simplify or ignore completely and still end up with a beautiful result that you're happy with. So let's get started. I'm painting on 140-pound cold pressed paper. You will need a couple of round and maybe 1 flat brush. I've listed all my supply. My first layer of color with very diluted watery paint using only 3 primary colors. Primary yellow, and I'm using quinacridone gold. Primary red, I'm using permanent alizarin crimson. And primary blue, here I'm using ultramarine finest from Schminke. Which leads me to the most frequently asked question that comes up in the context of painting portraits with watercolor. So, can 3 pigments really give you a full range of skin tones? The short answer is yes, absolutely they can, but there are some nuances and limitations. Let's take a look at a separate palette for a moment where you can see that primary yellow and red can mix into a variety of oranges and pinks, giving you a good starting point for any medium to light skin tone. Depending on the amount of water you add, this can get lighter or darker to fit your particular subject. Primary blue with yellow gives us a green, and primary blue with red gives us a purple. These are useful for darker and olive skin tones, but also general shadow definition, even on the lightest skin tones. In this painting, you can see that I add these blues and greens mostly on the right side of the face, where the shadows are most pronounced. So then, why do we often see other pigments in addition to the primary set when painting faces? First of all, keep in mind that depending on the triad of primaries you choose, the overall mix will have a certain tone, either warm and subdued, which is what we have here, or if you go with a different set of primaries, like for example phthalo blue instead of ultramarine, or maybe quinacridone red instead of alizarin, you can get much more vibrant results. So in this scenario where I'm using quinacridone gold, which is a very warm yellow, I can achieve a very warm natural pink for the skin, but I can never get a vibrant green for the eyes that I see in the reference photo. In other words, we can have a green, but we can't just have any green. Similarly, I can never get that truly cool, vibrant pink that would be necessary if I was painting, say, a newborn baby with light skin in direct sunlight. I would have to switch to a different set of primaries, using something like magenta for my primary red and phthalo blue for my blue primary. So that's limitation number 1 of using only 3 colors, is that depending on the 3 you choose, you get a different overall tone. Limitation number 2 is that you have to constantly mix and adjust, taking time away from the painting itself. Some artists don't mind and even enjoy this process, but I dislike the fact that mixes are often inconsistent. In other words, to replicate the same hue, you have to be very experienced, which is why shortcuts are welcome. And you can see now that I started the second layer of color on the girl, I'm introducing brown matter from Daniel Smith as a shortcut for my mix of alizarin crimson and quinacridone. So I hope that explains why you often see so many colors on artists' palettes when they're painting faces. And lastly, we have an issue with mixing neutral grays and warm browns, which is important for darker skin tones, but even on a lighter subject like this one, one I'm painting right now, we need these darker mixes for smaller details like the eyelashes, the brows, and eventually the hair. Will give you a variation of grays and browns, but is it enough to get really dark and to create the best contrast? I don't think so, although I do use it sometimes, as you can see in this example, but I'm never quite happy with the lack of contrast and the amount of effort it takes during mixing. Many artists who stick to primary triads tend to bring in a pigment called neutral tint, which is basically a way to darken any color without taking away from the original shade. I personally feel like bringing in neutral tint is already breaking the triad, so I don't think it's worth the effort. I believe it's much easier to just go for softer, natural, convenience grays and browns like Peril and Violet, which is what you will see me use in this portrait. This will give you my darkest darks without much effort and without wasting a ton of other pigments in the mix. But that's all just my opinion, of course. You need to experiment to really know what works for you and, most importantly, what type of process you enjoy. There's no right or wrong. I'm simply here to point out some of the technical aspects and limitations of both approaches and to give you some food for thought. I'm definitely in the convenience color camp when it comes to skin tones and everything else for that matter, but only because, as you will see through this process of layering, your lights and darks, meaning painting the shadows in the right spot, matters a lot more to the success of your painting and how realistic it looks. You can paint an entire portrait using one color only. Think about black and white photography and how amazing these portraits look without having any color in them at all. To use another example, Ali Kavanagh, who's one of the more popular modern portrait artists, uses a wild palette that couldn't be further away from the natural skin tones in some cases, yet her portraits look absolutely amazing because she is the master of light and shadow and she understands facial anatomy very well. So all that is to say, don't fuss too much about specific pigments. Try different triads, use what you have on hand, focus on capturing lights and shadows, and you will be amazed just how little specific colors matter and how much faster you will level up your portrait work. So now let's talk about how to capture lights and shadows and what aspects of facial anatomy you need to pay attention to in order to improve your results. To make this even easier, my favorite trick for any portrait is to convert the reference image into a black and white view. This way we can clearly identify the tonal groups of light and shadow without being distracted by color variations and other less important details. In this reference, our source of light is quite typical, coming from the top left. Depending on an angle of the facial segment you're painting, it will be illuminated by light differently, and we need to paint it differently using different amounts of water and different color mixes. So, in this example, the areas that are directly facing towards the light, like the forehead, the nose bridge, the top part of the cheeks, and the center of the chin, will be highlighted, meaning we need to avoid placing a lot of color there. As you see me progress through the layers, notice that I'm barely touching these areas with my brush, mostly covering them with clear water, often blending with a clean damp brush to make sure the border between light and shadow is not too harsh. Now let's talk about the shadows, which is where we mostly place our color washes, and they come in two main varieties. So-called form shadows are present on areas facing away from the primary light source. For example, you may notice that the right side of the face, the girl's left, but for us it's the right side because we're painting a mirror image, is slightly darker overall. That's because our source of light is coming from the top left, so everything on the right hand side is a few steps darker and the highlights are a bit more dim and somewhat smaller. All around the face we also have areas that are facing away from the light and also covered by hair, so we need some darker values there. One of the most common mistakes I see is people forgetting that subtle shading around the face is quite important if you want to accentuate the overall form. Now, the cast shadow, which is a different type of shadow, typically forms when an object blocks the light, creating a shadow on an adjacent surface. So when you paint faces, you will often find cast shadows visible under the nose, maybe under the brow bones and eyelids. All of these shadows are caused by blocking of light by these facial features. Let's not forget about the neck. That's completely covered by the chin and will largely be in the shadow as well. The lips follow the same logic. The top lip is always a little bit darker under normal lighting scenario because it's facing down and away from the light. The top lip is facing up for the most part. It's where the highlights are concentrated, so you may notice that I left a few spots without any color there, and overall the right side of the lip is slightly darker because our source of light is coming slightly from the left and there's a cast shadow from the top lip. So these are the form and cast shadows. That's where I'm putting down my big strokes, building additional values, meaning my darks, very slowly, and introducing some blues and greens into the darkest shadows because, as we discussed in the previous tutorial, the length of the light wave bouncing back from the skin and into our eyes from the shadow areas is different than the one coming from the highlighted ones. And it reads as different color by our eyes, which is why we often see blues and greens even on the lightest skin tones. These color nuances are important, but it's not as essential for the overall sense of realism in your portrait as the quality and the right placement of your shadows. I also want to point out some nuances that you may want to capture as you get more comfortable with painting faces. So there's some bounce back light that's often present in the shadows, which you may want to capture as well. Most often you will see this strip of light just around the chin. It's a little bit of light bouncing from the neck up. There's also a bit of bounce back light present under the nose and in the center of the brow and the eyelids. So if you can paint around these areas or lift the saturated color with a clean damp brush to create a lighter area within the shadows, that's very helpful. But these smaller accents are less important than the main shadows. Finally, you may notice the areas that are particularly dark, for example, the inside of the nostrils or the crease of the eye. These are called ambient occlusion. In other words, ambient light has a hard time getting into those areas. There's no bounce back light, and so those areas look completely dark, almost black. I'm going to achieve this by using my most saturated colors, pale and violet for the most part, and as always with watercolors, we can't erase, we paint light to dark, so our best bet is to leave these accents all the way until the end. In the final step, I will accentuate the darkest details on the eyelashes, the brows, and I will also paint the hair. I typically paint the hair in two steps. First, laying down the color of the highlights. In this case, it's an ochre with some basic shadows using wet on wet technique. I will then follow with darker tones using wet on dry technique. My final word of advice is to not overwork these details. You really just want to suggest the general shape without defining every hair strand. Trust me, it's not going to add much to the overall sense of realism, and instead you might overwork the details and make everything look more like a graphic illustration instead of a watercolor portrait. A few basic color blocks and maybe some thin hair strokes here and there is more than enough. So I hope this study clarifies some key questions that you had regarding watercolor portraits, which colors to use, and where to place your washes. Let me know in comments below if you want to see a more in-depth exploration on a particular topic related to this. Of course, there's some important nuances when it comes to light, different ethnicities, and even the age of the skin you're painting, but the general principles we just discussed apply to most skin tones and most lighting scenarios. The topic of portraits is very deep and requires practice, just like anything, including botanicals and landscapes. So I encourage you to think of this as a study of fundamentals. You can refer to this video if you're confused about particular shadow placement or pigment choice, but these apply to painting all faces, and you can use these principles